Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this seminar over the web on school reopening, and it's specifically dealing with the employment, HR, and health and safety aspects of school reopening. My name is Jean Boyle. I'm a partner in the employment team at Stone King. If I could see all of you, I'm sure I'd recognise a lot of your faces. So welcome and thank you so much for joining. I'm joined today by my partner colleague, Craig Vincent, who's head of our HR consultancy team, and Andrew Banks, who's also a partner and head of our court and regulatory team. We are giving this webinar in conjunction with ISBL. Some of you may understand and appreciate our relationship with ISBL. Stone King are one of the preferred legal partners with ISBL. We've worked with you for many, many years. And we act for lots and lots of schools up and down the country. I know some of you know Stone King, but if you don't, we have 5 regional offices: Leeds, Cambridge, London, Birmingham and Bath. And we act for, as I say, lots and lots of schools up and down the country. So let's get cracking with this webinar because we've got an awful lot to cover, as you can appreciate. As there are many, many delegates on this webinar, we are going to try and deal with some questions if we can, but the likelihood is there will be so many questions that we will have to deal with them via an email afterwards. So we will probably collate those questions and then deal with them via the email afterwards. Okay. So today's focus, we're going to have a look at what the government have said and the DfE guidance, the key points arising from that communication, which has been over the last couple of days, and hopefully some of you may have had an opportunity to actually read it. We are going to focus on the employment, HR and health and safety aspects. We cannot deal with all of the aspects of reopening in this particular seminar. Stone King independently are running a webinar on the 21st of May dealing with pupil and general school issues associated with reopening. So please do go on our website and sign up for that, because I'm sure it will be of great importance to you. We are also updating our FAQs on our website, so please do have a look at those as well, and they'll deal with school reopening too. So what do we know at the moment, and what does the guidance say? So the UK government's COVID-19 recovery strategy is entitled Our Plan to Rebuild, and it talks about returning life to as close to normal as possible for as many people as possible and as fast as fairly as possible. Now, we got that, I think, on Monday or Sunday night, and then we were obviously then waiting for the Department for Education guidance. The main government guidance focuses on the fact that children are losing days of education, and that is a key consideration in them implementing the next phase of measures. They emphasise that the rate of infection remains too high at the moment to allow reopening of schools, but there is clear concern that vulnerable children are not attending school in the numbers that they had hoped, nor the numbers that they want currently. So the emphasis is on getting vulnerable children back into school now, with a view to widening opening in a few weeks' time. They've also slightly tweaked the definitions in relation to those who are clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable. So just to clarify, because I will be referring to these terms throughout the seminar, clinically vulnerable is those over 70 with pre-existing conditions and pregnant women. The government guidance at the moment is that there's no need to shield those people, but they must stay home as much as possible and restrict contact. That is critically different to clinically extremely vulnerable. Those are the people that we have seen shielding. They have a letter from the NHS, and this is likely to go on beyond June. So it's just to keep those kind of definitions in your mind throughout, because we are going to be talking about the impact on schools from both a staff perspective and a little bit from a pupil perspective. Now, there's a lot of words on your screen at the moment, but I think it's really important that we just extract this particular piece of the main government guidance in its entirety. So when, I'm sure you did, when we got the government guidance and you Control F school, as I did, this is what essentially popped up. And it's talking about a phased return for early year settings and schools. So it's beginning to open for more children from the 1st of June. Just to slightly lighten the mood a little, I did notice about a third of the way down that it talks about children's coming back to school in smaller sizes from this point. I assume that they mean smaller numbers as opposed to the fact that we're going to reduce the size of children. But one can only assume that this was written in a bit of a rush. Okay, so we then got, on the 11th of May, which seems about a week ago now, but it isn't, the Department for Education guidance. Now we're going to pick up the key points here. Now I'm sure you have picked up these key points, but obviously as lawyers, we tend to kind of focus on the language a little as well, and just kind of trying to second guess a little bit about what might be happening. So one of the key points as I saw it really was the fact that it talks about planning and preparing. It doesn't say you must do this or you are going to do this. It talks about preparatory work ahead of a later communication. And that obviously depends on whether the tests for reopening schools are satisfied. We've heard vaguely on the grapevine that there will be a later communication about the firmness of any instruction from the government, and that might be on the 28th of May. But obviously at the moment we're quite unclear as to when it might happen. So the emphasis is about planning. Key point again, there's a clear concern that vulnerable children aren't attending school, and I'm sure that you picked that up. Obviously, nursery reception year 1 and year 6 return from the 1st of June, but again, some face-to-face support, slightly different in its language. So it's not saying that year 10 and year 12 will come back from the 1st of June, but it's talking about face-to-face support. All children effectively immediately, including childminders and early years providers and nurseries, are to reopen. And the position in relation to special schools is that they should be working towards a phased return of more children without any particular focus on age groups. And I think that's a sensible way of expressing that, given the demographic of special schools. Staff and pupils and members of the household will be eligible for testing if they become ill, was a key point. And they talk about the ambition of government for all primary year groups to be back before the summer holidays. Now, just pausing there's been a bit of confusion of language a little between Gavin Williamson and Boris Johnson. I kind of flung around some emails when Boris was speaking a couple of nights ago, where he talked about all schools going back for a month at the end of July. And I kind of thought, well, hold on a minute, that means it's going to be in the summer. We're not hearing any indication that schools will be open over the summer, actually quite the contrary from the Secretary of State for Education. But I think Boris might have got a little bit confused in his language, because later we've seen confirmation that the ambition, focus again on the language, the ambition is that all primary year groups would be back for a month before the summer holidays. So just having a little bit of maths here, we're usually breaking up around about the 20th, 22nd of July, take a month before that. That's why we put on there the 22nd of June. That starts to become a little bit close, really, when we're thinking about just those limited year groups returning on the 1st of June, and then essentially 3 weeks later, everybody else. So it's that's why I think it is an ambition as opposed to this will happen. Just focusing on years 10 and 12, some face-to-face contact is what is required, not a return to full timetable, and people will not be back full time. It's supposed to support and supplement remote education, and the emphasis is on that attendance at school should be limited. Okay, just getting into the details a little, and this is where we get into the clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable aspects. So pupils essentially are strongly encouraged to attend unless there are shielding concerns, and this is the 1st of June cohort, shall we call them. But if we are talking about staff and pupils who are clinically extremely vulnerable, remembering those are the ones with the NHS letter, those are shielding people, and those are not expected to return in any way at this present time. Doesn't mean from a staff perspective that you can't expect them to work at home. If they're fit and able to work at home, then you should maintain that position. Clinically vulnerable people, and that's those who have got pre-existing medical conditions, and we talked about those over 70s, should, and the government guidance is, remain working from home. However, staff or pupils who live with those who are clinically vulnerable should attend as normal. And we'll come on to talk about some frequently asked questions and questions that we think you might be interested in at the kind of back end of this seminar. Staff or pupils who live with extremely clinically vulnerable should only attend if stringent social distancing can be achieved, and they should be supported to work at home if possible, and social distancing isn't possible in the workplace. Again, that raises a lot of questions in the context of those who live with extremely clinically vulnerable, and we'll address some of those in the FAQs in a bit. So, protective measures they've suggested should be put in place for staff and pupils, and self-isolating due to symptoms, there's no requirement to attend school, and that's for pupils and staff. Key points again, classes should be halved, that's what they've suggested, and one teacher allocated to a group. But if there's teacher shortages, the Department for Education has suggested that support staff should be used to lead groups under the direction of a teacher. Again, raises some questions that we'll deal with in a bit. You should use your best endeavours to support pupils attending school as well as those remaining at home. And from my perspective and from Craig's perspective from an HR, they've mentioned well-being of staff, which I think is a really important aspect, and they've included senior leaders in that. They've talked about schools considering, and governing bodies in particular, actually considering flexible working practices, supporting teachers, and make sure that workloads are managed on a day-to-day basis, and that staff are assessed at home. Also, they have said that kitchens should be reopened and children should be provided with food. I'm just going to pass over to Craig.
Thanks, Jean. I just wanted to open with a slide just to share some information in terms of what trade unions are saying in relation to school reopening on the 1st of June. Again, I'm sure many of you have seen headlines over the past couple of days, particularly with quotes from trade unions, and I just wanted to share some of those to, in essence, assist you with your planning that may have started or obviously may start in the next week or two. So the general message from all of the trade unions that are relevant to the school setting is that the 1st of June is too soon, and actually trade unions are advising members not to engage with any planning for school reopening as of the 1st of June. I think it's maybe fair to say that the strongest wording at the moment is coming from the National Education Union that represents teachers. Represents 480,000 teachers in the UK. They're making strong statements such as the planning from the government is nothing short of reckless, and again encouraging members not to engage in planning at this stage. This morning I've actually seen via Twitter, which obviously isn't always the best source of information, that the NEU have sent a template letter to their members to send to head teachers, to let head teachers from an individual perspective know that they won't be engaging with planning. And what's quite interesting is actually the reaction on the format that I saw was that there was actually a negative reaction from the NEU in relation to this. From the members in relation to this, and they weren't actually taking that instruction on board as anticipated from the NEU. So whether that letter will be actually sent to teachers is might be an interesting point from the NEU's point of view. I think that the general message from the NEU is that opening before September is reckless, and they're very much saying health and safety should be at the forefront, and therefore any opening before September shouldn't be considered. So Unison have also supported that stance. Jeff Barton from ASCL has said it's frankly unfathomable that schools should open before September. And Paul Whiteman, who's the General Secretary of the NHT, was actually speaking to MPs yesterday, and he made a very clear point that classes of 15 are still too large, and it's still unsafe to teach classes of 15. And actually, if we are going to plan for reopening, it would be much more sensible to accommodate for classes of 10 or 12 students. Feedback that we've had from clients is actually to open for reception year 1, 2 and year 6 will actually require all of their teachers to be in school if they're going to have smaller groups as well. So there's been some initial quite a lot of concern in relation to how that's actually going to be achieved practically, and obviously that position is being supported by the trade unions as well. And I think the trade unions generally have expressed disappointment that despite the general conversations that they've been having with the government throughout this period, that the specific discussion around the 1st of June proposals weren't discussed with trade unions, and that's been a high point of contest as well. And the NHT in particular are asking for further evidence in relation to the scientific, for further information in relation to the scientific evidence that the government has based this decision on in order for the health and safety of their members. So I think the first thing that I wanted to highlight is actually your planning for school reopening may well be disrupted by the position of trade unions and communication with their members. Obviously, the announcement was only made on Sunday evening and guidance only came out on Monday. So I think it's just important to keep an eye on the position and the communication from trade unions in the next few weeks to assist you with your planning as school leaders as well. We just have the next slide, Jean. Thank you. As Jean said earlier, we thought it'd be useful to just share some of the frequently asked questions that we've received in the past couple of days and provide a response to them for your benefit. So the first, what the common question we've had is, can we ask teaching assistants to lead groups? So the guidance released by the DfE on the 11th of May obviously did state that teaching assistants can be allocated to lead a group of students working under the direction of a teacher if there are shortages. So what we would add in relation to that query is that this should be subject to, obviously the contract of employment that you have with teaching assistants, allowing that flexibility, and the job description being flexible enough to, to assign teaching assistants those duties. I think from a more practical point of view, obviously my initial reaction was that that's asking quite a lot of teaching assistants potentially. We know there's a difference in salary between teachers and teaching assistants, and they don't have the same regulatory approach that teachers do in terms of teaching standards, etc. So the psychological commitment that a teaching assistant has to the school and has to reopening may be slightly different to teachers. So that might just be something to bear in mind if you are placed in a position to ask your teaching assistants to lead some of the smaller groups. Second question that we've been asked quite frequently is, how do I know whether staff will be able to attend on 1st of June and who might have issues? The DfE have actually addressed that in initial planning framework guidance this morning that we've seen, and they've suggested that you start to ask employees whether there'll be any barriers for them any barriers in terms of them returning to work on the 1st of June should you reopen. Obviously, this is all bearing in mind that we're planning at this stage. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to allow staff to, to ask them if there's any potential barriers. In terms of obviously people who are vulnerable and clinically vulnerable, you may already have this information and may already have an inkling. But just bearing in mind the previous slide, that obviously this may be impacted by the trade union's position as well, and they may actually, encourage staff not to engage with the planning and not answer those questions. So hopefully they will, but it's just bearing in mind that potential situation as well. The third query, teachers may be asked to teach supervised pupils in schools whilst also setting work for pupils in the same class who are at home. Is this okay? In principle, we agree this can be done. Obviously, this is always subject to the compliance of the teacher's contract. Obviously, we've mentioned about flexibility and additional time might be required in order to allow this to happen. So it might mean shorter lessons for a temporary period, for example. However, again, we need to consider the trade union's stance during school closure, was that teachers shouldn't be planning or delivering lessons, but we would anticipate a lift in relation to that if schools do reopen on the 1st of June. There's suggestion within the DfE guidance as well that shielded employees can obviously can work from home as well, and obviously assist with the planning. Assist with the planning and delivery of lessons for the students who are at home because parents have decided not to send them to school. Obviously, whilst all that's happening, there's still work to be set for pupils in year 2 to 5 at the same time as well. So already, there's quite a lot of workload there for teachers in terms of students at home. And the final query: if we decide to keep children in classrooms and have teachers move around the site and teach in different rooms, can this be challenged by teachers? I think our view in principle is this is a reasonable request for an employer to make, but in the interest of health and safety, which Andrew will come on to, that position will need to be risk assessed. There's likely to be enough flexibility in the employment contract to allow this to happen, but obviously those decisions should be made as part of the bigger picture. I think the main advice in relation to planning is obviously to involve teachers in planning as well, where possible, and hopefully this glorious weather will continue, and alternative options such as outside teaching, produce a really good alternative for you as well.
Thanks, Craig. Just dealing with some more questions and issues, and I think this one is going to be particularly relevant. What if a member of staff has children in the relevant age groups, doesn't want to send them to school, and therefore can't come to work? I see that being a particular major issue for schools, and we've been asked that question a couple of times over the last couple of days. I mean, in principle, if the school is considered safe in line with the government guidance and their own risk assessments, then any failure to attend, even if it's for really good reasons associated with childcare, is a choice on the part of the employee. Obviously, from an HR perspective, we'd be urging a conversation to take place with that particular employee. If they're concerned about their own position, they're concerned about safety, then we can seek to allay those fears. But equally, if it's to do with childcare primarily, we would always be having those conversations with staff if they had childcare issues in unusual circumstances. So it's kind of thinking about home working, but also giving staff a reasonable time frame to obtain alternative childcare, bearing in mind that childminders will be open and working. I think there really should be some consistency in how schools treat employees in these circumstances. And it may be in due course that you need to speak with that employee about different types of leave, whether that be parental leave or indeed some unpaid leave. I mean, in general, normal times, an employee can take time off work to look after dependents, but that's intended for short periods of time, and there's no statutory right to be paid. So really, I think at this point, it's a time, and the government's urged you to plan, it's a time to start thinking about what you're going to do when staff say, I don't want to send my kids in, so I need to look after them at home, and what your general approach is going to be, and the consistency, keeping that consistency. So if a staff member lives with a clinically vulnerable person, can they work in early years? Well, this is a really, really tricky one, I think, because the DfE's guidance says that if a member of staff lives with someone who is clinically extremely vulnerable, again, note the different definition, that member of staff can return to work as long as social distancing can be adhered to. However, the DfE language says that actually social distancing isn't possible in early years. So those people potentially can't return to work, and certainly can't return to work in an early year setting, in my view. Clinically vulnerable obviously is different. So if they live with somebody who's clinically vulnerable, again, over 70s, pregnant, pre-existing condition, then they can and should attend work as normal. I think the rub comes really if they live with somebody who's clinically extremely vulnerable and work in early years. And as I say, in my view, that's not necessarily possible. Doesn't mean to say, however, that you can't move them into possibly year 6 if that might work. So can we expect teachers to wipe down desks and chairs between classes to maintain hygiene? I think this is a difficult one. And again, going back to what Craig said about the unions, I think that thinking about first principles, that isn't really a teacher's job. And I think that the trade unions are likely to object to any requirement for teachers to do that. I mean, I think you can ask, and I think there's an awful lot of goodwill, and teachers may be willing to do that. But I don't feel that you can require teachers to do that, to do any kind of level of cleaning. Equally, given the challenges that we talked about in the question above of teachers perhaps not wanting to come in and other staff not wanting to come in, then you might want to make sure that the teachers that you have got in school are doing teaching work and supporting TAs, etc., to teach children as opposed to wiping down classrooms. So can we instruct support staff then to do it? Potentially, but again, the same principles apply. You don't employ support staff to be cleaners. You employ cleaners to be cleaners. And I'm sure your support staff are much better placed doing their jobs. Also, not to kind of undervalue the work of cleaners. Support staff and teachers aren't trained to be cleaners. And I'm sure Andrew will pick up on this, but the kind of cleaning that will be required perhaps is not just a bit of a wipe down with an anti-bac. We are talking specific types of obligations here to make sure that the workplace is safe. Is there any expectation that schools will open over the summer? Not that we've heard. In fact, actually, Gavin Williamson actually suggested, I think explicitly, that they wouldn't be. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. What do we do in the following scenarios? So a member of staff says they're healthy, but they can't come in because they don't feel safe. Now, Craig is going to join me, by the way, in this particular slide because there's an awful lot in it. So if there's two voices speaking, apologies for that. Well, we would always recommend communicating with that particular staff member as to what the school's done to make the workplace safe. So you might want to share your risk assessment. You might want to talk them through the things that you're doing to make the workplace safe. Now, we saw anxiety and stress caused by COVID right at the outset of this. So, and I'm sure you did, that staff were saying, actually, I don't want to come in and I'm really, really anxious about COVID and the consequences. And so we really reiterate that advice that we gave at the time. So if they're anxious, if members of staff are anxious but not sick, it's arguable that they're choosing not to work. And they should be, the fundamental principle of the employment relationship is that the employee should be ready and willing to work. And therefore, in principle, and obviously we don't want to do this, if somebody's refusing to come into work, then in principle, you can refuse to pay them. Now, I don't want any schools to get to that situation, and from an HR perspective, that's not going to go down that well. But we would encourage you to talk to employees about their anxiousness. Now, obviously, if that anxiety then results in an illness, that's then going into the kind of sickness aspect of your relationship, and they would be paid in line with your sick pay policy. So I think it's going to be a very difficult aspect of dealing with all staff. But I think that, again, thinking about those things now and how as a school you can ensure a consistent approach to that kind of issue is really, really important. Craig, have you got anything to add from an HR perspective on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's being said. I'll just, add that reminder that to keep well-being at the top of the agenda as well. It often, gets pushed down as we start focusing on other things. But obviously, the well-being of staff, including yourselves, I might add, as business leaders as well, is essential. I think the cynic in me was quite pleased that there's actually 2 paragraphs about staff well-being in a government document. That was really, it was good to see. But yeah, we're just banging the drum to keep well-being at the top of the agenda, and it will involved a lot of individual conversations and due to different circumstances. But as we said, equal treatment across the board is essential as well. And there may be a time where you have to make those tougher decisions in relation to pay.
I think we know the position in relation to shielding. So obviously, if an employee is shielding, they shouldn't attend work, and they are available to work at home. Just be careful, as I say. I know as a lawyer, it's really easy for me to kind of bang on about definitions, but just be careful about your definitions of shielding, because employees might say to you, "Oh, I'm shielding." And under the new definition, they should be clinically extremely vulnerable, and they should have a letter from the NHS. Now, my view is that it's not unreasonable as an employer to ask to see that letter. I'm not suggesting that you would have staff that would say that they're shielding and they're not supposed to, but the cynic employment lawyer in me suggests that maybe that could happen if a particular employee is anxious about returning. What if they've got primary age children and their school is not accepting them? So the school is not open, refuses to open, or indeed they're not in the age group. I think the issues are slightly different. When we had the previous slide where we talked about an employee who did not want to send their child to school, then that is a choice of that individual, albeit I think a rational choice, but it is a choice. However, if we've got a situation where employees are unable to come into work because they really do have childcare issues and it's not of their doing, then that obviously can be dealt with in a different way. And again, going back to the general position of what would usually happen if an employee's had childcare responsibilities. And I think the same applies for secondary age children as well. I don't think we should have this assumption that just because little Johnny is 14 that's okay, he can be left at home. I think we need to think carefully about consistency in the approach in that respect. So looking after elderly or vulnerable relatives, again, very, very difficult. And I think as schools, you're going to need to decide what your stance is going to be on that. Many people will not want to attend work because they're going around to care for a relative occasionally, and they don't want to then bring anything from school home. I think what you need to do is look at the government's advice and take that as a basis, and then ensure that you have a consistent approach. But fundamentally, unless they live with somebody who's clinically extremely vulnerable, then essentially they should be at work. And even if they do live with somebody who's clinically extremely vulnerable, they should be at work but socially distancing, but with that caveat in relation to the early years that we discussed earlier.
Thanks, Jean.
Craig.
Yeah, thank you. Hope those questions have assisted. As Jean said, keep the questions coming in and we'll address them after the session. Just wanted to finish off. I've been asked a couple of times about performance and pay decisions. The NEU actually a few weeks back made their position clear in relation to performance-related pay decisions that may be made in December. And as you can see on the slide here, they're asking schools to agree to set PRP aside this year, and in essence allow all staff to progress through pay progression. Our view is, is that obviously this is advisory, and I think with additional sensitivity, of course, given obviously all the work teachers are doing and have been doing the past few weeks, that underperformance can still be addressed. And as you may, as you've done in the past, where people are absent from school, if you have an evidence-based approach and you're managing through appraisal and performance management, it still may be possible to not allow all staff members to go through pay progression if that's a decision you wish to make. Obviously, you should continue to follow your policy as you normally would. I think the main thing I might say is those borderline decisions. There's probably an expectation that schools will be more flexible in relation to that, but where there's clear, significant evidence to underperformance, pre-school closure, I think our advice would be that you can still address that moving forward as you normally would in September, obviously with I guess increased caution and with the expectation of greater challenge potentially from trade union and employees. Thank you very much. I think that's our HR employment session covered. We're going to pass you over to Andrew now, who's going to give you some hints and tips in relation to health and safety.
Thank you very much indeed, Craig. One very quick question for both of you, actually. I'm very conscious of the time on the clock, and just a very practical question. Are we able to overrun? I don't want to rush through what I have to say, but I can deal with key points if needs be. Do we know the answer to that?
Yeah, I think we are. It's not going to cut us off, I don't think. Yeah.
Fine. Thank you very much. It's only that I don't want to rush. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Banks. I'm a regulatory lawyer at Stone King. I'm a partner in the court and regulatory team. And in terms of the education sector, that involves me engaging with schools in relation to health and safety issues. I also represent schools at inquest. Sometimes the two issues are tied together. Just one very brief piece of housekeeping. I'm clearly not working in the office at the moment, and the joys of working on a video call. Just by way of a very brief anecdote, the other day I was sitting in this very chair in this very room, which has the best Wi-Fi, which is why we all selected where we're sitting, not for aesthetic reasons. And I'm actually facing a window, and the sun shone. It lit my face up and darkened the whole room. And someone said it reminded them, for those of you who are old enough to remember this, of Freddie Mercury in the Bohemian Rhapsody video. So if that happens during the course of of my session, that is not deliberate, and actually it may be the most engaging part of it, I suppose. In any event, this is basically a non-exhaustive session on your approach to health and safety in return to work planning. When I say non-exhaustive, that's not a cop-out, but the landscape is changing on a daily basis. I initially prepared the slides for this presentation last week, and then of course the government guidance came out in detail in any event on Monday evening. So I spent a lot of yesterday potentially ripping up all the slides I've written and completely rewriting them. I'm pleased to say actually I was pleasantly surprised in that my crystal ball was reasonably accurate, because much of what the government suggested is what I expected. But there are one or two key areas which I will dwell on in my session, where they've actually chosen to do things slightly differently to the way that I expected. But the landscape is changing, and further advice is promised in due course as well. I'm not going to, well, I am going to ignore the controversies around the 1st of June date. What has actually been said is that is the earliest date that schools can go back, and I wouldn't be particularly surprised if that date is then moved. And I think the reality will be, although there's a lot of stress about class sizes and the like, one has to plan for the eventuality that most of the school pupils who are allowed to return wish to return. But the reality may well be that many parents will not send their children to school anyway, and actually in a much reduced school population, not least because the government has said that although they think it's safe for, or from the 1st of June, it'll be safe for some of the younger members of the school population to return to school, they aren't going to find parents who do not send their children to school. So it seems to be almost a tacit recognition that actually maybe there are some caveats to the approach that they've taken. In terms of the people that have attended, I'm aware from this that I've seen that there are people from many different backgrounds. There are people from multi-academy trusts, and you will probably have your own health and safety advice in any event, and probably in much more detail than I will give you today. There will also be representatives from single academy trust schools and single primary schools who will be looking for a steer from me. What I intend doing today, although this is by virtue of time, if nothing else, an overview, I will try and give you as much detail as I can, particularly in relation to mitigating features, because I think in terms of the risks, many of those risks are fairly obvious, and the guidance is quite clear in some risks up to a point about the sort of approach you should take in terms of risk assessment and return to work planning. But there are some ideas out there you may wish to consider about mitigation. I also, at the end, you'll be pleased to hear, I'm going to endeavour to reduce your anxiety in relation to some of the issues that have been raised with us in the last couple of weeks, which have been preying on the minds of school leaders. and in particular in relation to the implications of a return to work where you feel in your own mind maybe this is not quite safe, but yet the government is telling me that it's safe to return. And what are the implications for me if I do return in that setting and then something goes horribly wrong and someone contracts coronavirus, or worse than that, someone dies of coronavirus? I think I can probably reduce your anxiety in relation to the catastrophizing there's been in relation to that. So to start then, I am a lawyer, so I'm going to give you a bit of law, and I think it's helpful to do so actually, because very often in health and safety one gets bogged down in a phenomenal amount of detail, and actually it's always best, as John Major once said, to get back to basics in these things. And this is the only bit of law really I'm going to refer to. But first of all, it's important to look at the overarching legislation in relation to health and safety at work. And what the Health and Safety at Work Act says is that every employer has a duty, so far as it is reasonably practicable, to ensure the health, safety and welfare whilst at work of their employees. And there's an analogous provision in relation to people who aren't employees, for example, school pupils, visitors, contractors, etc., as regards their health and safety. And the key phrase in that is what is reasonably practicable. So in all this, you need to keep in mind, whatever steps you're taking, whatever risk assessment you're drafting, that the key basic principle that governs what you do in the health and safety context is not an expectation you must eliminate every single risk that there is from coronavirus, but you must mitigate it in a proportionate way. You must do all that is reasonable in the circumstances. There may be reasons, for example, of cost, or there may be reasons of space why you are not able to do what you would very much like to do in terms of mitigating the risks. What the law says is that you must only do, or what you're required to do is what is reasonably practicable. There are specific regulations, management of health and safety at work regulations, relevant regs, in relation to risk assessments. And I've set out there that every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of his employees they're exposed to whilst at work. So in terms of the situation regarding coronavirus, what you will need to do is you will need to draft a specific coronavirus friendly risk assessment in order to add to your existing risk assessments to show how the landscape has changed. Now, it may be the case that you need to revisit some risk assessments that you've already done, and we'll come on to that in a bit, but you will need an overarching one in relation to the risks from coronavirus. And shortly, I'm going to take you through some bullet points in relation to the issues that you can consider in that. That also needs to take account, incidentally, as the Health and Safety at Work Act does, of a risk to people such as pupils, contractors, visitors. You may have seen, we've all been reading the various bits of guidance that have come from the government in the last few days, and the guidance that I'm going to be referring to in the main, or which forms the basis of this session, is the guidance entitled Implementing, actually it's called Coronavirus 19, Implementing Protective Measures in Education and Childcare Settings. Very, very snappy title, but insofar as we have any detailed guidance from the government in relation to health and safety, that is where that guidance lies. But the important thing is this: in many respects, I shouldn't have put that section on this slide, because this slide says law, and guidance is not law. It is just an indication of things that you can do, in the same way that this presentation is an indication of things that you can do. And there'll be parts of the guidance that, for reasons, for example, of space, which is something we'll come back to, you just cannot apply in your school setting. Next slide, please, if I may. Okay, just waiting for the next slide. Okay, very briefly. So in terms of strategy as far as health and safety is concerned, really there are three documents you need to be thinking about drafting. Risk assessment, as I've said, I'm starting in the middle here, and possibly revisiting old risk assessments when they may need to be varied, is something that is a statutory requirement under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. You will also need, I think, inevitably, to draft a social distancing policy. And that, although I'm not going to deal with that specifically in this presentation, in actual fact, it's going to encompass all the issues that you'll need to consider in terms of social distancing. Return to work plan is not necessarily something that you have to commit in writing. There's nothing written down in law that says that you have to do that, but it's a very good idea to do that, not least because it gives you a clear indication of what your plan is. If there's a case that anything goes wrong, it can be referred to. It's also something that you can share as well with your employees. And we'll look at all these in turn, but we're going to start first of all with some principles. So Jean, if you'd be kind enough to move on to the next slide, please. So again, in the same way that in approaching health and safety, I always think it's wise to go back to basics and to look at what it's reasonably practicable for you to do. And I'm sorry if I keep repeating this, and I will do throughout this, but it's something that I do want you to take away from the session today. But in the same way, I think in terms of return to work planning, you need to think about the principles behind the decisions that you are making, what your priorities are. And it seems to me that they're at the top of the tree is the health and safety of people and pupils. That has to be the priority. Taking into account, of course, that you're not going to eliminate all the risks associated with that. You can mitigate them as far as you can, as far as is reasonably practicable, but you're not going to eliminate them much as you would like to. The second thing is to follow government guidelines. And it may be that at the moment one has read a bewildering amount of information and formed the view that the government guidelines are not particularly clear in certain respects. And I think it's fair to say that in certain respects they are actually quite detailed and quite clear. But there are other occasions where the silence on particular issues, particularly I think in relation to the protection of teachers rather than the protection of pupils, where there are concerns that the guidelines maybe need improvement. And we are told that that finessing will come. But certainly as part of the plan, those are guidelines that you should follow. As Jean was out indicating earlier, you can still promote home working if and where it's possible to do that. Now, I appreciate the school setting, that's a bit more difficult than in the Stone King setting, where here we are all sitting at home and addressing you in a comfortable environment. In a school environment, that's going to be probably of limited application, but wherever it is possible, then that's something that perhaps is a good starting point. We're going to go and look at risk assessment. So, Jean, if you'd be kind enough to put the next slide. Thank you very much. So in terms of risk assessment, what I'm going to give you here is basically a set of bullet points about issues that you should consider, because we're going to look in a little more detail about a number of these issues in due course. And there is a degree of repetition, and I'm hoping by there being a degree of repetition which is necessary, that actually the points that I'm making will sink in. So the first bit of repetition: in your risk assessment, factor in the government guidance. And as I say, there are some details which are really helpful actually in providing a risk assessment. You must, of course, draft a risk assessment in the same way that you ordinarily would, by identifying the hazards and then setting out the mitigating features. Although very often in risk assessments, you will be giving particular consideration to people who have some particular vulnerability, this is heightened at the current time. And I think one area which I'm pleased to say I don't think has been overlooked, and I take into account everything that Craig has said about the fact that well-being and mindfulness is something, or well-being at least, is something that is mentioned in the government guidance. You do need to take account of people's anxieties. You will find there are members of staff in particular who are very keen not to come back to school and completely refuse to come back to school. But on the other hand, you will have people who suffer from anxieties who are actually desperate to come back in circumstances where perhaps they ought not to. So one has to be considering the vulnerability in more than one way. Obvious vulnerabilities involve people who are very old, very young, and people with underlying illnesses, as Jean has already indicated. What you could do, and in drafting a suitable and sufficient risk assessment, I know a school has already asked me a question in relation to this, is do they deploy a health questionnaire or undertake some form of health surveillance before staff return, or do they even do such a thing in relation to pupils? The government guidance is silent on that point, but it does provide some detail about risk assessments. It may be more detail comes up in due course. I'm not entirely convinced that the risk assessment will not be suitable and sufficient if you do not do that, but it may be a good idea if it is reasonably practicable to do it, because you've got within a particular school, you have a relatively small number of employees rather than across a whole multi-academy trust where, of course, you'll have thousands potentially. It may be a good idea to have some kind of very brief health questionnaire before staff return to work, basically dealing with issues such as, have you been feeling unwell in the last 14 days? Have you been with anyone else who has suffered from coronavirus? And questions of that nature. It doesn't need to be something that is particularly complicated. Governing the whole risk assessment or throughout the whole risk assessment will be an assessment of social distancing and where you can deploy those measures. And as I said before, you will need a separate policy in relation to that. Although I'm not going to deal with that alone, you will see as we go through the areas to consider that in actual fact, much of the mitigating circumstances relate to social distancing and such things. So, for example, looking at the entrance where pupils and staff enter the school, where they leave the school, how you manage movement around the school, what signage you impose, and what you do about furniture and the like. And again, I'll come back in a little more detail in due course. Analogous to that, or running alongside that, is also risk assessing the movement of people around school. How do you generate a situation where you have as few people as possible moving around the school as rarely as possible? That's really what you want to try and achieve. You want to avoid the cross-contamination of classes and people. Slide part 2, please, Jean. Also included the risk assessment should be a consideration of travel to school. Now, some schools will be heavily involved in travel to school and some will not. And all I can say on this subject at the moment is that when you read the government guidance, there is a promise of more and specific guidance in relation to travel to school. For those of you who do or are involved in the organisation of school transport, probably what it will involve is your contractors, where they may provide, say, one coach bringing children from a particular location to the school. They may have to provide 2. And the pupils sit in every other seat, or maybe even 3, or however that may transpire. Although one has to take into account, of course, from the 1st of June, it is the 1st of June, what is being suggested is a smaller school population in any event, because it's not suggested at that point that everyone will come back to school. But we are going to get some more specific guidance we promised in relation to that. In fact, if this is like any of the other webinars that I've undertaken, that guidance is probably being printed right now as I'm speaking. But we'll wait and see what happens with that. You'll need to give thought to first aid for obvious reasons. I'm going to deal with that in specific detail later on in my session. Obvious risks and the risk of transmission relate to cleaning and also the hygiene of not only staff but obviously pupils as well. And managing the hygiene of pupils is going to be really quite difficult. And I think really the best way of managing it is to make sure that facilities are available, and soap and what have you available, that clear messages are given by staff and before pupils return to school about necessity for hygiene, and that you engage with parents in relation to that. But I'll come back up to that again when we come to the communications part of my session. In terms of cleaning, again, as Jean was indicating, really what you're looking for there is an engagement with your cleaning contractors to ensure that the cleaning regime that you have is sufficient in these times. And that means you're going to have something which is going to have to be an enhanced version of what you have at the moment. And you'll need to take their advice because they will be doing the same thing with all their other clients as to what they feel the appropriate steps that need to be taken are. Risk assessments as well, you need to look at vulnerable pupils. Much has been said about the return to school of pupils with some vulnerability, but sometimes those pupils are also pupils who have their own individual risk assessment in actual fact, and their own individual needs that require careful management. We're going to deal with that subject in more detail at the session on the 21st of May. At the moment, I have it down just as a bullet point, just to remind you to take account of that. Another risk, it seems to me, which is obvious, is about communications. I've already referred to that about communicating in relation to pupils' hygiene and the importance of that. there is a risk from there being unclear communications at these times. Everyone needs to be as clear as they can be about what the expectations are, about what they can and can't do. And perhaps to give you a little example of this, for example, communications to parents about when and in what circumstances they should bring their child to school if they're the person that's transporting to school. Say they're a child of primary school or infant school age and they don't get to school under their own steam. You need to be clear about, for example, if there's staggered timings, about the time that a pupil is brought to school, because any latecomers are at risk then of cross-contaminating another group, another cohort of pupils. So communication needs to be really clear about what you would do in circumstances such as that. Next slide, please. So in terms of actually drafting a return to work plan, there are a number of preliminaries that you need to consider in the planning. I've put a separate section in relation to building, and then I'm going to deal with other factors, because much of the planning will revolve around buildings. The first point I've made is about checking that your utilities are up and running, so things such as gas, electric, etc. That may be irrelevant to many schools, because of course many schools are actually up and running at the moment in any event. And I include that point purely for the sake of completeness, because if the school has been literally closed for a while, it is something to bear in mind, particularly in relation to water and the risk of Legionnaires' disease. If water has been kept, it has not been moving for a period of time and it's become stagnant, you need to take care in relation to that. And hopefully you all have risk assessments in relation to or policies in relation to water management of Legionnaires' disease in any event, but they may need to be deployed. Cleaning, if the building has been empty, or even if it hasn't, you're going to take on a larger number of people. That's to make sure that this enhanced cleaning program is deployed before the school reopens in the way that we're describing, and that you have as clean environment as you can when people arrive. You need to give some consideration to the doors that can be left open, and this sounds like a phenomenal piece of detail. What we're dealing with here is the removing the necessity for people to touch door handles that other people have touched moments before, door plates, etc. Where it is possible, clearly you're not going to be able to leave fire doors open, but there will be other doors around school buildings, classrooms, that you may be able to leave open. But then you give some thought to a first aid room. You are going to need a space where people can be isolated, if only for a short period of time. Some schools may already have this, some schools may not have the space for this, and the first aid room may be a shared space with something else. You're going to need consideration for a contingency in relation to that. You will need to give consideration as well in terms of the buildings to access to toilets, of which more later. Kitchens and communal areas, and the brackets are actually in the wrong place. When I was thinking about communal areas, I've actually thinking also about staff rooms and the like, and how you can deploy it so far as you are able social distancing. And remember, in a primary setting, the government has indicated that they don't expect that you're going to be able to manage social distancing, and that's no surprise to me at all. But you will be able to in relation to your staff. So thought will need to be given to how you manage those areas. And one of the ways that you can manage it is by putting up signage and markings on the floor to appropriate spaces. You'll need to give consideration to how people are going to move around the school. Are you going to have a one-way system? And so is that going to be something that is practical in your school? Or are you going to have markings, as you would in the middle of the road, in every corridor, where pupils and staff can keep to one side of the corridor if it's wide enough, whilst passing people moving in the opposite direction? And again, much is going to depend on the infrastructure of your school and what you can actually achieve. And coming back again to this point about what's reasonably practicable to do. You are, and this is one of the biggest concerns I think that's been raised thus far, going to be practically concerned to space management. I have seen some guidance, although it's not in the official government guidance from recollection, and you'll have to forgive me because I've read a phenomenal amount of guidance in the last 24 hours when I haven't been asleep. And you'll see that there's been a lot of concern about space and about how these classes of a maximum of 15 pupils are going to be able to be deployed around a school building. And thought can be given, for example, to using a hall or using a gym. And the guidance that I have seen has suggested that schools will not be encouraged to undertake PE, and they will not be encouraged to undertake music lessons either. So thought can be given to how the building can be used in a constructive way to be able to have smaller classes, but using the space that you have. Thank you. Next slide, please. Other things to consider. So this is a point, I put an exclamation mark there because I was a little surprised by this, and my slide changed at this point because when I drafted the slides originally, I thought there would be advice from the government that PPE was going to be a requirement. It very much is not a requirement in terms of conventional teaching, and it is not recommended in the classroom. But you still need to secure PPE, not least because you are going to need it in terms of those situations where someone is displaying some symptoms and needs management in the first aid setting. Secondly, you may need it because there are some pupils who have vulnerabilities that require you to use PPE in any event. So yeah, you should secure PPE. And also, of course, it will give reassurance to some staff who may insist on using it. Although it's not recommended, there's anything to say that they can't use it if they wish to do so. Sanitizer and soap is a very obvious one. I suspect everyone is already on that. Move and remove furniture. Again, this is about decluttering and enabling you to use your space as much as you conceivably can. And I've said that that includes toys, and I don't want to be a complete killjoy and really, really miserable. But the risks, obviously, of toys being passed from one child to another and sharing them are considerable. And although, as I say, the government says you're not going to be expected to socially distance in a primary setting, the fact is you do want to reduce the risks as much as you can. Not only the obvious reasons, but also give reassurance to your staff as well. So toys, I think, should be removed as a preliminary. Enhanced cleaning I've referred to already, and you'll also need to engage with contractors. Again, cleaning I've referred to before, and also in relation to food, and more on that point in a moment, because it may be at the moment you're not supplying any food, but you need to do that very shortly. Let's have a brief look at first aid. So I've said you need to plan for illness at school in the event that a member of staff or a pupil contracts coronavirus. If a member of staff contracts coronavirus, I say contracts coronavirus, that's being dramatic. If they show symptoms that may be consistent with having contracted coronavirus, then quite simply they should make their own way home as it's possible, and arrangements should be made for the class to be covered in whatever way they can. In relation to pupils, it may be more difficult because parents will have to be contacted. There may be delays in parents being able to pick children up, and they need to go somewhere whilst they are waiting for that to happen. And that's why you need a first aid room. And you do need a process to manage what happens if a child in their class sticks up their hand and says, "I'm not feeling very well. I think I've got a bit of a temperature. Or I can't stop coughing," or words to that effect. So you will need a plan, and I suggest, in addition to the plans I suggest in writing at the outset, it should probably be in writing and shared with your first aiders, because you will need to train your first aiders on how to manage people with coronavirus. And you will need, of course, to check that actually you do have first aiders amongst your staff around the school, because it may be that some of the people you would ordinarily use are not available for reasons of shielding, their own vulnerability, etc. All the things we've talked about before. So it is good to have a plan, and I can tell you, because I've already had this experience, not with a client in the education sector, but in another sector where the HSE have been asking some questions about the plans that they put in place, and they indicated that their expectation was that there was a plan in relation to if someone becomes ill at work or ill at school, as a pupil at school, what the plan is from there. So you should commit something to writing. PPE I've already referred to, because that is an area where you will need masks, shields and the like available, whatever the government says in relation to the remainder. Disposal of waste I put there because you will need to give consideration. If you have a child, for example, or a member of staff who's coughing uncontrollably, consistently, which is one of the symptoms, and coughing into a tissue, what are you going to do with those? So you need to have safe bins for that. I should say you should also have similar bins, I think, are deployed around classrooms as well, in order that if children just have the usual coughs and sneezings, there are tissues and things available for them to then dispose of those tissues, and also that they are then encouraged to wash their hands as soon as possible afterwards, all part of the communications regime. The cleaning regime for the first aid area, I'm talking about the contractors coming in again, is going to need to be particularly enhanced, and you will of course need sanitisers and wipes and the like available in that room. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at the mitigation one take. I have touched on some of these. I said there would be a degree of repetition, but finally, I'll look at some in more detail than others. So PPE, I think we've pretty much exhausted that. As I say, good to source it anyway for the reasons I've already explained, but also because some people may wish to have it, and the guidance doesn't say that people can't use it around the school. They just say that the rationale is that it's not going to be effective because masking, for example, will only be effective when you're with the same people for a short period of time, which in the course of the classroom you wouldn't be. So as Jean has already indicated, although in a primary setting social distancing isn't expected, you are encouraged to, or told, in fact guided to, have small cohorts of pupils, and that those small groups shouldn't exceed 15. How are you going to try and manage social distancing as far as you can with those pupils? Well, keeping desks apart as far as you can. Clearly, classes are going to have to be split. What do you do at break times? I mean, there are suggestions about having particular parts of the playground marked off for particular groups. So that's another way potentially of managing small groups of children. And the aim here clearly is to have discrete groups of children around the school at any one time, and that they do not contact other parts of the other small groups within the school. You try and keep them separate and discrete as far as you can. Again, it comes back to this really practical point. I think Jean's probably handled the issue about teaching assistants being deployed to teach classes where clearly you may have a staff shortage for a number of reasons, and I've put their big question mark next to space. I have to say, again, this is somewhere where I perhaps in my crystal ball didn't quite get this right, because I expected the guidance to be that pupils might come in for, say, half a day, and you could have half of a class in the morning and half of a class in the afternoon. And actually, to my surprise, what's being suggested is actually everyone comes in, albeit will come into mitigating features about the timing of the day in a moment. But that they are split into two classes, which means then you may have a space issue. Now, clearly your whole school is not going to be back, and you will have a reduced number of children, I believe, because of the fact that parents aren't going to be fined for not sending them, and some will be risk averse enough not to want to send their children. Some will be desperate to send their children and get them away from the Xbox and all of that, but some won't be, and one has to respect that. So in terms of space, what can you use? Well, halls, gyms, maybe partitioning those. Those are the sort of options that might be available. The government guidance is that if you are stuck in relation to space, you should, in the case of a local authority school, or refer to your local authority, or in the case of the school within the academy trust, refer to the trust. It may be that there is a potential, if one's being really imaginative, and if this is for contractual reasons or whatever, achievable, or finance or management generally, maybe the option of teaching some children in a different building or in a different school, because secondary schools may be by and large empty for some considerable time. One thing that I think is a sensible precaution is to keep classes in situ. So rather than move children around the school to have different lessons in different places, and I appreciate that's more true of a secondary setting than a primary setting. If the school can be timetabled so that the same people remain in the same place for as much of the day, then that's to be welcomed. I think staggering the arrival at school in the morning amongst groups and the end of the day is very wise if that's achievable. So if there was a cohort that were asked to arrive at 8:30 and the next one arrives at 8:45 and then the next one arrives at 9 o'clock, that would be a possibility, seems to me, to mitigate the risks, and the same obviously applying at the end of the day. Staggered breaks and lunch as well are have potential. One thing that's suggested in the guidelines is about staggered assemblies, and given the lack of space and the wisdom of having an assembly where large parts of the school, at the rest of the time you're trying to keep apart, you suddenly put them all in the same space at the same time. It seems to me at the moment assembly may be something that just has to be avoided, not least because the hall, I suspect, is likely to be used for other purposes. Food. This was a bit of a surprise to me. I expected, or I do understand the rationale, I expected the government to say that they would encourage people to bring in packed lunches and drinks to consume during the course of the day, in order to avoid, again, unnecessary traffic from one part of the school to another, unnecessary coexistence between different groups in the same place at the same time, but apparently not. So that bit I confess I got wrong. I think the rationale is, again, a focus on vulnerable children and children who are having school meals. And I do understand that, and there's necessity to encourage them to come back because they will get school meals and they will be provided for there. But the advice in relation to that seems to be very, very robust. And there doesn't seem to be any suggestion at all, which surprises me, about the wisdom of packed lunches and drinks, which to me seems to be a precaution that is worth taking, and a suggestion that one maybe could make to pupils, albeit on the proviso that they can have school meals if that's what they want and require. Again, something that may not be achievable next, splitting staff into a number of shifts. I appreciate that probably that's not going to be achievable for most of you, because what you'll have is a situation where you have more classes to deal with, although you have fewer pupils, and you're going to have to deploy the same number of teachers you would if you had the ordinary school. But if there's any way of deploying that, because certainly in an office environment, say in terms of Stone King, we're going to split our teams into two and have the 1 week off, 1 week on shift. But I appreciate in the school setting, I think that's likely unrealistic. But where you can do it, you might be able to do it related to sports staff. Maybe that's something you give consideration to. Next slide, please. So in terms of movement around the school, if you are embarking on a one-way system, you need to have clear comms about where people are going to come into the building and where they are going to leave the building, and make sure that that is enforced. So signage can be helpful in relation to that, and communication, particularly with parents and pupils beforehand, so they know what the situation will be. I've mentioned outside classrooms. There's two aspects to that, one of which is maybe we could teach outside, which is what Craig was referring to before, and I remember as a child greatly enjoying sitting outside and learning in that environment when the weather's good enough for that, which at the moment happily seems to have been. So there's always the option to do that. But one other thing to take into account, and it's not particularly a point related to outside classrooms, other than perhaps demountables and the like, is about getting access to the classroom. So it could be, and this may be in some schools that this is already done, but it could be that rather than pupils being encouraged to enter through their normal entrance, that they enter the classroom if they wouldn't ordinarily do so from outside, and gain access to the building that way. Again, it avoids cross contamination, because there is a discrete entrance for that particular cohort of children to have. Stairs will need to be given some consideration. There is signage that I've seen already that you can place at 2 metre intervals on the stairs, because that can be a pinch point sometimes when people are moving around the school. Handrails, this is a difficult one because handrails are there for people's safety, and yet in some respects you don't want to touch them. I think all one can say in relation to that is to ensure that they are as clean as they can be, and real attention is given to them. We're British, we like queuing, but queuing should be eliminated, it seems to me, wherever practical, around the school. So queuing outside classes, etc., at the start of the day, if that's a system that you have in the moment, I think that's probably something that may need to be replaced, if it can be, and support needs to be given to minimising queuing, because that's where one can see, particularly with very young children, they can all be concertinaed and start messing with one another. There should be sanitizer available in each class, access to washing and cleaning. And here we are. I've been a lawyer for 25 years, and this is the pinnacle of my career. I could be spending an hour telling you about how to manage toilets in a school setting. And in all seriousness, I think that is one of the more challenging aspects of the return to work. Let's look at the government guidance, which at the moment on that particular subject is rather vague and basically indicates that it will need some management. I think in terms of management, the flow of children into toilets is going to need managing. You will probably need a member of staff there as an effective toilet attendant. It may be that you are looking at using cubicles alone. In the boys' sense, girls' sense is going to make no difference, and that there is signage from one particular cubicle to one particular wash basin. That's as imaginative as I've got on the subject of toilets, but all I would say is it's going to need support, and you are going to need to think about it in the context of your own facilities and what you have. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about communications. I'm thinking about four groups in particular. So in relation to staff, and this has been mentioned already, consultation. It may be that some of you have, because of the degree to which you're unionised, you have health and safety committees already, and you will be required to engage with them in relation to your return to work planning. It is healthy in any event to consult with staff in order to get them on board. I've already been in one case, again not in an education setting, where the HSE had become involved because of disagreements between staff and the employer, and it appeared that the engagement and consultation with staff was not all it could have been if I put it in those circumstances, although well intentioned. So you should certainly engage with staff, not least because you may be able to give them some reassurance in relation to some of their concerns. In relation to parents, I think the comms in simplified form should probably be fivefold. First of all, don't bring in children who are ill, or if you are ill. You should only have one parent accompanying a child to school if they need to be accompanied coming to school. They should be given clear guidance about timing for entry and exit from school. They should encourage not to do what parents always love doing, which is gathering at the school gate and chatting amongst each other. However much social distancing has been relaxed, or at least the lockdown has been relaxed, they shouldn't be encouraged to do that. They bring the child to school, let them go, and then go. And when they wait at the end of the day, they wait discrete distance from one another, collect their child, and then leave. So it's not an almighty scrum. You'll also need to give them communications about transport. Again, we're waiting for more specific guidance on that. And in relation to contractors, you'll need to be clear with them about what they need. I'm thinking particularly about cleaning, of course, for obvious reasons, and food as well is a minor curveball the government through me, if no one else, in relation to making sure that they are able to provide what is required. Next slide, please. So finally, what I'm going to deal with is the anxieties that our clients have sort of brought to us. And there's a bit of catastrophizing going on, if I can even pronounce the word, about the risks associated with returning to school in an environment where you cannot cover every single risk to both pupils and staff. And let's start at the top with the most serious, and these aren't in a hierarchical form, anything to add. Corporate manslaughter. We're getting inquiries from people saying, well, what if someone dies at the school? Am I going to be prosecuted for corporate manslaughter? Well, the glib answer to that is that as an individual, you will not be prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, because that only applies to corporate bodies. So an academy trust could be. but an individual could not. But an individual could, in theory, be prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter. Is that going to happen? Well, if you'd asked me to give you a yes/no answer to that, I'll stick my neck out and say no. I'm not sticking it out very far, because for a corporate entity to be in a, or an individual to be in a situation where they're being prosecuted for either of those offences, effectively you would have to have a situation where you really didn't do any planning, you ignored all the risks, you didn't take account of any of the government guidance, and then something really, really bad happened. And these are offences which are reserved for the most serious cases where there are the most blatant breaches. And clearly, and I think we can take into account a number of people that have attended this webinar, people within the education setting are not made that way. People are concerned, people are worried, people are anxious. And I cannot see any circumstances in which a school or an academy trust is going to be prosecuted for corporate manslaughter or an individual for gross negligence manslaughter as a consequence of coronavirus. That doesn't mean to say that the Health and Safety Executive will not necessarily put challenging questions your way if any shortcomings are brought to their attention. But there is a practical difficulty, it seems to me, in terms of any prosecution. One, a prosecutor would have to prove that your breach was a gross breach. And again, that comes back to this thing of there being really no systems and not clear. That's what most of these cases are about. It's not about a case where you have plans, systems, risk assessments in place, but there is some detail that has been overlooked or not managed to the nth degree. That's not what corporate manslaughter is about at all. So I think that's one issue that means that schools are not going to fall foul of this. The second one is you have to show causation. So you have to show that the person who has contracted the illness actually contracted it on your watch. And how is one going to be able to prove that? At the moment, I don't think that's possible. One can speculate and hypothesize. These are offences that have to be proven to the court is sure. These are very expensive offences, investigations for the HSE in concert with the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, to run. And quite frankly, in the coronavirus pandemic, they're just really not going to be looking at this. You really don't need to be worrying about that. So hopefully I can put your anxieties to one side in relation to that. So, okay, that's not the only thing you could potentially be prosecuted for. There are other health and safety breaches. I set out Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act at the start of this, your requirement to ensure as far as is reasonably practicable the health, safety and welfare of your employees, and the analogous provisions in relation to other people. I don't think at the moment that the Health and Safety Executive have got the appetite to prosecute people for breaches of that nature either in relation to coronavirus. My engagement with the HSE at the moment has been that they are asking questions where complaints have been raised about to them about an employer's response, but is very, very far short of a prosecution of anything of that nature. So I think you're pretty safe in relation to that as well. But you do need to be diligent. You do need to be doing the sort of things that the government guidance indicates, and I've suggested. I've mentioned inquests. It's a world that I inhabit quite a lot. And you may at the start have thought that I was an ambulance chaser in mentioning that. In actual fact, I have to say the complete reverse is opposite, because I don't think there will be many, if any, inquests in relation to coronavirus, not least because one of the things that the coroner has to consider is whether someone has died a natural death, and I think they will blanket decide that dying from coronavirus is a blanket. Is a natural death, sorry, is what I meant to say. And as a consequence, I don't think coroners are going to be very interested in this. So then there's the risk of civil litigation if someone becomes ill and sues for damages as a consequence of that, or if someone dies and their family sue as a consequence of their losses associated with that. Again, I think that civil litigation is going to be very unlikely. Interestingly, yesterday I looked at the internet to see if there are any ambulance chasing members of my brethren. I'm talking about lawyers here in the personal injury sector, and there aren't. No one is chasing in relation to coronavirus claims. Quite a lot in America, which may not be a surprise to you. But again, I think there are some issues there, because in order to successfully sue a school or academy trust in relation to a claim for negligence, because you haven't done all the things that the claimant's view you should have done, you'd have to show, first of all, you had a duty of care. That a duty of care was owed to the claimant. Fairly easy to establish. I think you have a duty of care to employees, you have a duty of care to visitors to your premises, such as pupils, etc. Second part, though, you have to show that you've breached that duty. And again, if you're following government guidance, you're doing everything that's reasonable, I can't see that there's going to be much merit in the claim, even if, in spite of all that, someone then contracts the virus. And thirdly, there's a causation issue as well, because how can anyone say where they've caught it? They may have gone to Tesco on the way home from school and caught it there. So I think there are real difficulties in any claims, and that's probably why there isn't a lot of, although it might be phenomenally distasteful anyway at the moment, which is as political as I'll get. I do think that the likelihood of there being many claims in relation to that is pretty small. There will be a test case somewhere. It probably won't involve a school, but the other thing that you need to keep in mind, of course, is that you do have insurance, and your insurance will take the stress out of that for you by managing that in the ordinary way. Thank you for your attention. We have overrun. There was a lot to get through. I'm going to hand over to Jean, who's going to collect.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, for that, and thank you, Craig. Apologies for the overrun. You'll appreciate this is all new stuff, and so it's really, really difficult for us to time it accurately, especially given the short lead-in for this webinar. I have been trying to answer a couple of questions as we've gone along. If I haven't answered your question, I'm really sorry. Obviously, we've been trying to kind of do that and also run the slides along. We will be communicating with you afterwards. If anybody wants to email any of us, our details are on the back of these slides, as is on your screen at the moment. So please do email us. We're more than happy to make a contribution in any way that we can to help you get schools the advice that they need. So thank you so much, everybody, for taking time out of your day to come and share this with us. So thank you.
Thank you.